Hey everyone, happy Monday. I hope you guys had a good weekend. Before we get started, go over a few things. Just want to remind everyone that I am still doing the office hours on Tuesdays and Fridays if you guys need them. Always optional, of course, but if you guys do need them for anything, they are same time as always. And then the information for those meetings, if you want to get on those, is on the announcements tab on Canvas. So we will go ahead and get started with what we are doing today, and that is looking at ancient and medieval Japan. So this is a time of feudalism, samurai, and Bushido. Okay, and I feel like you guys probably know what a samurai is, but you don't probably maybe not really sure what it does or what their purpose was. Feudalism, you may have heard this term before. I'm not entirely sure. And then this Bushido is something that I am probably sure most of you have no idea what that is, and we'll look at that here shortly. But as far as what we're going to be doing with this lesson, hopefully by the end of this, you'll be able to understand what feudalism is and the impact it had on Japanese society. Hopefully, we'll be able to explain the influence that China had on early Japan. Maybe hopefully we'll be able to explain what a shogunate is and how it works. You'll be able to describe the role that samurai played in Japanese society, and then lastly, you'll be able to understand why samurai followed this honor code known as Bushido. Okay, so first thing we're going to look at is early influences on Japan. And so early on in its history, Japan was actually very much linked with the Korean Peninsula. They had very similar cultures, traditions, that kind of thing. And then eventually they began kind of separating and making their own unique cultures, traditions. And a lot of that, though, was still heavily influenced by what was happening in China. So I know it's been a minute, but if you remember when we talked about China way back in the school year, remember we had talked about how all those different inventions that China came up with: gunpowder, writing, printing, fireworks, all those things. A lot of that stuff had spread outside of China too. So it was moving into the Koreas. It was moving into Japan even. Um, so it's different inventions the Chinese came up with, different writings, technologies, political thoughts like how a government should work, who it should work for, what it should and shouldn't do, and even religion had begun to spread across the region into the Koreas, into Japan even. Despite being separated by that the Strait of Korea we talked about last time, Chinese culture was still able to get a foothold into Japan, and a lot of what early Japanese history is used to is dealing with China, dealing with the Koreas. As you'll see here in a little bit, Japan kind of fought to make its own identity in a different way than others, and we'll look at that here in a second. But one of the things that we're going to mention is that I want to highlight is that Buddhism actually moved to Japan. If you remember when we talked about India, Buddhism was actually founded in India, but had moved into China and other parts of Asia. And then eventually it even reached to Japan and became one of the more widely practiced religions in Japan at this time. So just early ways that China was influencing the cultures of the region, particularly Japan. This next thing we're going to look at is known as the Heian period, and it's known as being one of the more important periods of Japanese history, and it was from 794 to 1185 CE. So you're looking at about 400 years here. This era is important for a couple of reasons. The first one being that the Japanese emperor was forced to rule in name only, and that he had no actual power. So before this period, the emperor of Japan was seen as the end all be all as far as leadership thought in Japan. If the emperor said you couldn't do something, that was it. There was no debate. There was no Congress. There was no Supreme. There wasn't any of that. One person essentially decided the whole fate of the country. And so after this kind of this period of the Heian period started, the emperor was forced by local rulers, known as daimyo, to give up most of his power. They still celebrated him as a godlike figure. They still respected what he had to say, but he had no authority to force these daimyo, these local rulers, to do what he wanted. He was there as kind of a ceremonial figure, and that was it. So that was one reason this area is important. The second one is that the system of feudalism was adopted across Japan. You may have talked about it last year with Mr. Lewis, but we're going to look at it a little bit again because it's a little different. Japan kind of puts their own twist on it. So we're going to look at that again. And then we're going to look at the introduction of samurai into Japanese society. So we're going to look at who these samurai are, what their purpose was, how did they figure into all of this? The Heian period is also known as a high point for Japanese aristocracy, who exercised great wealth and power during this period. And if you're not familiar with an aristocrat it's someone who is from a privileged social class or part of the nobility. So the higher up you are on the social ladder, the better chance are you were part of this aristocracy. And in this period, these people, through the daimyo, ruled a large part of Japanese society. So this period, the Heian period, is important for a lot of reasons, but those are kind of the three we're going to look at. So the next one is we're going to look at feudalism and then the samurai in general. So if you're unfamiliar with what feudalism is, it's defined as a social system in which nobility held land in exchange for loyalty and military service. And then also in exchange for protection, warriors were allowed to live on these lands. Peasants were able to live on the lands in exchange for their work on farms or just other products. So kind of a long definition, but to shorten that for you, feudalism is where a noble, an aristocrat owned some land and he allowed peasants and merchants to live on that land if they promised to give him a portion of whatever they made, whether that was crops at the end of the year, or that was a cut of their income, if they were merchants, that kind of thing. So through that, he also promised to protect the peasants who lived on his or her set of land. And to do that, they hired what is known as samurai. So samurai are kind of like the knights of Japanese feudalism. They're the guys who dress up in the nice armor. They're the ones that do all the fighting. They're the military protection for the aristocracy in Japan. So if you want to think of the samurai as the Japanese version of a knight, that'd be a good way to look at it. They were the military protection that helped maintain this system of feudalism. So they're the ones who, when something happened, the aristocrat needed someone to take care of a problem, he would go to the samurai who would do that for him. So also in Japanese society during this period, there was an unofficial, official set of social classes. It's not as strict as the caste system in India where like you were stuck in that one class and you couldn't move. It's a little more flexible than that, but this kind of outlines what this class system looks like in Japan. You have the emperor on top. You have shoguns, who we'll get to in a minute, the daimyo, the samurai, and then the peasants and craft workers and merchants down towards the bottom. So the samurai aren't super high on this list, but compared to everyone else, they're rather high, and that'll be important here in a second. So as part of being a samurai, you were held to a much higher standard than ordinary Japanese people. You were expected to follow a code of honor known as Bushido. And this Bushido code kind of outlined what you could not do, what was expected of you as an honorable samurai, what was expected of you to accomplish, that kind of thing. The samurai were strict followers of this code. And eventually this code would just go into the rest of Japanese society. And so this code of Bushido becomes super famous in World War II as to why people from the West, Americans in particular, trying to understand why the Japanese army largely refused to surrender. They'd rather fight to the death than surrender. As part of this Bushido code, they were expected to be fearless in the face of the enemy, and they were expected to commit ritual suicide rather than surrender. So oftentimes you were expected to commit suicide rather than surrender to the enemy. If you surrendered, you brought dishonor on your family, you brought dishonor on yourself, and you could not go back to your home with the same status you had before. So a lot of samurai and later ordinary Japanese people adopted this system of Bushido, of fearless in the face the enemy and refusing to surrender. And so this code becomes a part of the Japanese military during World War II, and we'll get to that later next week probably, as far as World War II in Japan and all. But this Bushido thing isn't just a one-time deal; it shows up again and again. So going over what shoguns and samurai are. So the samurai kind of developed during this Heian period, it's 800 to 1200 essentially. During that period, they became super powerful, almost as powerful, in some cases, if not more powerful than their local daimyo, the local leaders. And so eventually they started creating their own clans of samurai. And these clans became so popular, so influential that in 1192, Minamoto Yoritomo was chosen by the Emperor of Japan at the time and named a shogun in 1192. So shogun, all that means is this person was declared supreme military leader of all Japan. So at the first, this meant they controlled the military. They controlled all the samurai. They controlled all the peasants in the military, that kind of thing. Over time, this grew to be absolute full political control, control of governmental decisions, control of foreign policy, control of trade, control of cultural aspects, who could come, who couldn't. The shoguns ended up essentially being what you might call the president of Japan, if they had one at the time. So after Yoritomo here was declared shogun, the first shogun in 1192, there would be several different shogunates over the next few hundred years until the arrival of Tokugawa Ieyasu. So the period after Yoritomo dies and before Tokugawa shows up is marked by a series of internal conflicts in Japan. A lot of infighting, a lot of civil war. And so the Tokugawa shogunate, founded by Tokugawa Ieyasu, was started in the 1500s, and it drastically changed Japan politically, socially, and economically as well. So the Tokugawa shogunate became known as, started in the mid 1500s, and Tokugawa became worried about Western influence on Japan and began putting in place different policies that kind of brought about a 200-year period of isolation. So Tokugawa here was afraid that Japan was being corrupted by Western influences, by Christianity, by Western ideas, inventions, practices. He was afraid it would destroy Japanese society. So his government, himself, and then his successors after him began kind of putting different laws and things in place to try and make sure that didn't happen. But despite all this period was actually a period of relative peace and stability in Japan. You saw a rise in the merchant class, people who, just merchants in general, And it also led to an increase in urbanization in Japanese cities. So that's a term I haven't used before, but what that means is there was an increase in the number of people who moved from the countryside to the cities during this period, during this Tokugawa period. So if you ever see the term urbanization, it just means the number of people moving from the rural areas to cities. And during this period, that number rose dramatically. But this was also a period of isolation for Japan. Under Tokugawa and shogunates going forward, they outlawed Christianity in Japan, and they also banned trade with foreigners, so people non-Japanese, both in Japan and outside of Japan. So not only would they not let foreign merchants into Japan, Japanese merchants couldn't go outside of Japan. It was a complete lockdown of Japan in a sense. It's a period known as the isolation period in Japan, isolationism. Japan just cut itself off from the outside world in a sense. And I say in a sense because even though they refused to trade with like Europe and later the United States, they still maintained close diplomatic, cultural, political, economic ties with Japan and Korea. So while they cut themselves off from Western influences, Europe in particular, they still wanted to maintain a sense of connection to their neighbors, people who had similar cultural aspects that they did. Not entirely the same, obviously, but enough that they felt they could comfortably trade with these people without worrying about being influenced by their foreign ideas. So the period of Japanese isolationism would continue for roughly 200 years after Tokugawa took power in the mid-1600s. It ended largely with the arrival of the United States. So in 1853, the president of the U.S. at the time, Millard Fillmore, sent Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan with 4 ships, hoping that he could convince the Japanese emperor, the shogun at the time, to allow U.S. merchants to trade with Japan. The reason for this was technology had increased to where there were now widespread use of steam and coal ships, and whaling industries had moved into the Pacific Ocean, and these ships needed places to stop and restock on supplies. And they looked at Japan as a good way to do that, since Japan was real close to China, and the U.S. had been trading with China for a while at this point. But Japan largely had refused. There are known cases where American sailors would shipwreck on Japanese islands and would be killed essentially. Like the Japanese would kill them and not allow them any chance to fix their ships and get back out. The Japanese just killed them. And so President Fillmore at the time wanted to open Japan up for those reasons and also economic reasons. He looked at Japan as a new market for the United States. And so he sent Matthew Perry with 4 ships to open Japan up by force if necessary. So Matthew Perry arrives with gifts for the Emperor of Japan, such as a working model of a steam locomotive, a telescope, telegraph, and a variety of different alcohols from the West. The United States was unaware at the time, just because lack of knowledge, information, what have you, that the emperor held no real power, because Matthew Perry came and had all these gifts for the emperor, not knowing or understanding that the emperor had no power to decide any of this on any of the things Matthew Perry wanted. So it was actually the shogun at the time who controlled all of the decisions. And because of the Japanese period of isolation, they had kind of fallen behind technologically. And so they saw these massive American ships roll into Tokyo Harbor, and they had nothing that could fight those. And so you're probably wondering, like, how could 4 ships open up an entire country? The Japanese had nothing remotely capable of taking on the the American ships. And so Matthew Perry gave the Japanese shogun at the time a year to decide what he wanted to do. And what did he want to open up, or was Matthew Perry going to come back and force and open it himself? And so the Japanese and the shogun at the time agreed in March of 1854 to open up Japan to American trading, and the two sides signed the Treaty of Kanagawa on March 31st of 1854, essentially ending Japanese isolation and bringing Japan into the modern world in a sense. And this is important for the fact that Japan's opened up, but it also leads to a massive technological science military rebuild that we're going to look at on Thursday, known as the Meiji Restoration. But for now, that is all I have. So a quick reminder of stuff that you'll need for today. The assignments on Canvas under the module for April 27th. It's going to be 5 short answer questions, several materials I went over here. As always, feel free to use notes, rewatch the video of this, go over the PowerPoint, whatever you need to answer those questions. As always, if you have any other questions, reach out Zoom, or reach out via email or Canvas. And then again, I'm still doing those office hours on Tuesdays and Fridays from 12:30 to 1:30 if you want to ask questions that way. Otherwise, the information for those are on Canvas in the announcements tab. And that is all I have for you guys. So I hope you guys had a good weekend. I hope you guys have a good week. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know.